All right, let's dive into Europe between the years 1200 and 1450. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Castles, knights, a lot of dust, but honestly, this period is anything but boring. This is when the very ideas of nations, the tug-of-war between church and state, and social structures that would last for centuries were all forged. And we're going to break it all down by looking at it through three key lenses: faith, power, and land.
So that really brings us to the big question, doesn't it? How did this patchwork continent full of competing loyalties and different faiths end up laying the groundwork for the modern world? How did this chaotic era set the stage for huge events like the Renaissance and the Reformation? Well, let's find out.
You really can't understand this period unless you start with the single most powerful force of the time, religion. For pretty much everyone, faith wasn't just, a part of their life. It was the entire operating system, the spiritual glue that held their whole world together.
To put it another way, Christianity was that spiritual glue. After the whole Western Roman Empire fell apart, it was the church that gave people a common identity, a shared set of rules and values across a continent that was just politically fractured. But, and this is a big but, it wasn't one single unified thing. And this slide really shows you that fundamental split in Christian power. Over in the Catholic West, political power was all over the place. That created a kind of vacuum that the Pope often stepped into, which gave the church incredible sway over kings and nobles. But in the Orthodox East, totally different story. The church there backed the centralized power of the Byzantine emperor, creating a system where the state and religion were just completely linked.
So, how did we get here? This timeline gives us the quick version. The political split really kicks off when the West collapses in 476. Then, the religious split becomes official with what's called the Great Schism in 1054. And a huge chapter comes to a close in 1453 when the Ottomans conquer Constantinople, which basically ends the Byzantine Empire as a political force.
But here's the crucial takeaway. Just because the empire fell, that didn't mean the faith was over. Not at all. Eastern Orthodoxy didn't just vanish with Constantinople. Instead, its center of gravity kind of shifted. It found a new champion to carry on its traditions, especially up in the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe.
And you can see that legacy in action right here. The Kievan Rus, which was this powerful state in what's now modern-day Ukraine and Russia, very deliberately modeled itself on Byzantium. I mean, look at this. They adopted Eastern Orthodoxy, the architecture, the Cyrillic alphabet, and, there's a big one, that same idea of a super tight bond between the church and the state.
Now let's jump back to the Catholic West for a second. The church over there had its own big ideas for trying to unify the continent. The most famous example? The Crusades, of course. And while they pretty much failed in their military goals, they had this massive unintended side effect. They reconnected Europe to the huge trade networks of the East, which brought back all sorts of new goods, new ideas, and a ton of wealth. And of course, it's so important to remember that even with Christian dominance, Europe was not a monolith, not even close. Islam was a major force, especially down in Spain and Portugal. And Jewish communities were spread all across the continent. They played huge roles in trade and scholarship, even while they often faced horrible persecution and marginalization. Okay, let's peel back our second layer, power. So, if you looked at a map of Western Europe back then, you would not see the nice, clean borders of countries we know today. No way. Instead, you'd see a really complex, messy, decentralized patchwork of territories, all held together by a unique system of personal loyalties. And that messy system? We call it feudalism. And really, the best way to get your head around it is to think of it as a web of personal relationships. Power wasn't held by some central government. It was all built on mutual obligations between people, oaths of loyalty given in exchange for land. And this slide lays out that structure perfectly. You've got a king at the top who grants huge chunks of land to his most powerful lords. Those lords then turn around and grant smaller pieces to knights. And in return, those knights pledge loyalty and promise to fight for their lord. And at the very bottom, holding this entire thing up, are the peasants and serfs who are actually doing the work on the land.
So, if feudalism was the political framework, you can think of manorialism as its economic engine. This was the system on the ground that made everything else run. Each of those pieces of land was usually organized as a manor, basically a self-sufficient estate that was the center of pretty much all economic and social life for almost everyone.
But here's the thing. This decentralized system wasn't set in stone. Towards the end of our period, so getting close to 1450, a huge shift starts to happen.
Ambitious kings and queens, especially in places like France and England, began to consolidate their power. They started challenging that old feudal order and building the foundations for what we'd recognize as modern countries.
So how'd they pull it off? Well, as you can see here, they built professional armies that were loyal directly to them, not to some local lord. They created government bureaucracies to collect taxes more efficiently, and they set up royal courts to handle justice. Every single step was a calculated move to chip away at the power of the old feudal nobles and centralize control. And that brings us to our final and maybe most fundamental layer, life on the land. Because underneath all the popes and kings and knights, medieval Europe was an agricultural society. The entire economy, the social structure, the rhythm of daily life, it was all built on the soil and the coerced labor used to work it.
Now, at the heart of this whole system was the serf. This is a status that gets misunderstood a lot, so let's be super clear. A serf was not a slave. They couldn't be bought and sold like property, but they weren't free either. They were legally tied to the land they worked.
This comparison is so important. A slave was considered personal property. They could be bought and sold at will. A serf, on the other hand, was part of the estate. They came with the land. They couldn't be sold away from their family or the manor. While they did have some basic customary rights, their freedom was massively restricted. It was absolutely a form of coerced labor.
So what was the deal exactly? This table breaks down what's sometimes called the manorial bargain. The serfs provided the labor, they gave the lord a share of their crops, and they paid various fees. And in return, the lord was supposed to provide protection from invaders, a small plot of land for the serf's family, and some form of local justice. In a nutshell, it was a trade of freedom and labor in exchange for security.
And this number puts everything into perspective. 90%. Just let that sink in. That's roughly how many people in Europe were working in agriculture. This wasn't just a part of the economy, it was the economy. The entire rhythm of life for almost everyone was dictated by the seasons. When to plant, when to harvest. Okay, so we've looked at faith, power, and land. Let's pull all those threads together. We've seen how they each worked on their own, but what kind of picture do they paint when you put them all together as we get close to the year 1450?
So, here's the snapshot. For faith, you've got this complex religious landscape. It's dominated by Christianity, sure, but with really important Muslim and Jewish communities too. For power, you're seeing that big shift away from decentralized feudalism and toward stronger, competing kingdoms. And for land, the entire system is resting on an agricultural economy built on the coerced labor of serfs.
And this is maybe the most important thing to take away from all this. None of these things existed in a vacuum. The power of the church totally shaped politics. The feudal political system structured the entire economy, and the agricultural base decided everyone's place in the world. It is all deeply, deeply connected.
So we'll end with this question for you to think about. How did this specific mix of ingredients, the tensions between popes and kings, the wealth pouring in from new trade routes, this really rigid social hierarchy, how did all of that set the stage for everything that came next? How did this world lead directly to the explosion of art and science in the Renaissance and the shattering of religious unity in the Reformation? Understanding these connections, that's the key to understanding how our modern world was born.